When Karen from the HOA calls 911 to have you evicted over a parking dispute, she has no idea the responding deputy is your upstairs neighbor, who's been secretly collecting evidence of her tyranny for months. What begins as a petty complaint soon unravels into a full-blown confrontation, revealing the sinister depths of suburban power struggles. It all started with a parking spot. You'd lived in your apartment complex for 2 years, and for the most part, it had been peaceful. Sure, there were the occasional noisy neighbors or late-night parties, but nothing out of the ordinary for a place filled with people from all walks of life. That was until Karen, the self-appointed HOA enforcer, decided to make your life her personal project. Karen was the kind of person who lived for rules. She had a clipboard perpetually tucked under her arm, a permanent scowl etched on her face, and a seemingly endless supply of passive-aggressive notes she left on doors, windshields, and even mailboxes. Everyone in the complex knew her, or rather, knew to avoid her. But no matter how hard you tried to fly under her radar, it was only a matter of time before she found a reason to target you. The first warning came on a Tuesday morning. You were rushing to work, coffee in hand, when you noticed a neon green slip of paper tucked under your windshield wiper. It was a citation from the HOA, informing you that your car was parked outside the designated lines of your assigned spot. You glanced at your tires, confused. Sure, you were a little close to the line, but you were still well within your space. Shrugging it off, you crumpled the paper and tossed it into the passenger seat, chalking it up to Karen being Karen. But Karen wasn't done. The next day, another citation appeared, this time with a more threatening tone. Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in further action, it read. You rolled your eyes and decided to ignore it. After all, you had bigger things to worry about than Karen's obsession with parking perfection. By the end of the week, the notes had escalated. Karen started leaving them on your front door, each one more aggressive than the last. This is your final warning, one read. Correct your parking or face eviction. Eviction? Over a parking spot? You couldn't believe the audacity. You tried to reason with her, knocking on her door one evening to explain that you were doing your best to park correctly, but she refused to answer. Instead, she watched you from her window, arms crossed as if daring you to defy her. The breaking point came on a Friday night. You'd had a long week and were looking forward to a quiet evening at home. As you pulled into your spot, you made a conscious effort to park perfectly, even getting out of your car to double-check the lines. Satisfied, you headed inside thinking the matter was finally behind you. But an hour later, there was a pounding on your door. It was Karen, her face red with rage. "You're still over the line," she screeched, pointing an accusatory finger at your car. You tried to stay calm, explaining that you'd made sure to park correctly, but she wasn't having it. "This is private property, and you're in violation of the rules," she shouted. "If you don't move your car right now, I'm calling the police." You laughed, thinking she was bluffing. But as you closed the door, you heard her on the phone, her voice shrill and panicked. "Yes, I need an officer immediately. There's a tenant here who refuses to comply with HOA regulations, and I need them removed." You couldn't believe it. She was actually calling 911 over a parking spot. As you waited for the police to arrive, you felt a mix of anger and disbelief. Little did you know, the deputy who would show up at your door wasn't just any officer. He was your upstairs neighbor, Mike, and he'd been quietly documenting Karen's antics for months. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about to become a full-blown showdown. The knock on your door came less than 10 minutes after Karen's outburst. You braced yourself, expecting the worst, a stern lecture, maybe even a citation. But when you opened the door, you were met with a familiar face. It was Mike, your upstairs neighbor, though you'd never seen him in uniform before. He stood there, his badge glinting under the porch light, a look of mild amusement on his face. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Got a call about a parking dispute. Mind if I take a look?" You stepped aside, still processing the fact that Mike, the guy who occasionally waved hello in the hallway and whose footsteps you heard pacing above your apartment at odd hours, was a deputy. He walked over to your car, crouching down to inspect the tires. Karen hovered nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a mix of triumph and impatience. See? She snapped, pointing at your car. It's clearly over the line. This is a blatant violation of HOA rules, and I want this tenant evicted immediately. Mike straightened up, his face unreadable. Ma'am, I don't see any violation here. The car is within the lines. Maybe a little close, but it's not breaking any laws. Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red. But the HOA rules, she started, but Mike cut her off. HOA rules aren't the same as the law, he said calmly. Unless there's an actual crime being committed, there's nothing I can do. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to speak with the tenant privately. Karen sputtered, clearly not used to being dismissed. She shot you a venomous glare before storming off, muttering under her breath about incompetence and favoritism. Once she was out of earshot, Mike turned to you, a small smile playing on his lips. Sorry about that, he said. Karen's been a thorn in everyone's side for a while now. I've been keeping an eye on her, but she's careful. Never crosses the line enough for me to step in, until tonight. You blinked, surprised. You've been watching her? Mike nodded. Yeah, I've lived here for about a year, and in that time, I've seen her harass just about everyone in the complex. She's got a knack for making people's lives miserable without technically breaking the law. But this, he gestured to your car, calling 911 over a parking spot? That's a new low, even for her. You sighed, running a hand through your hair. I don't get it. Why is she so obsessed with this? It's just a parking spot. Mike's expression turned serious. It's not about the parking spot. It's about control. Karen thrives on power, and the HOA gives her the perfect platform to exercise it. She's been pushing people around for years, but no one's ever stood up to her. Until now. You frowned. What do you mean? Mike leaned against the wall, his tone thoughtful. I've been gathering evidence, complaints from other residents, photos, emails. But every time I think I have enough to take action, people back out. They're too scared of her. But tonight, Karen called the cops on you for no reason. That's harassment, plain and simple. And with me as a witness, we might finally have a case. You felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. Even if we do, what's stopping her from retaliating? She's already threatened to evict me over this. Mike's smile returned, but there was a steely determination in his eyes. Let her try. She doesn't know I'm a deputy, and she definitely doesn't know I've been building a case against her. If she wants to play hardball, we'll play hardball. But first, we need to get the rest of the neighbors on board. Are you in? You hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Karen had pushed you too far, and if Mike was willing to help, you weren't going to back down. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about taking back your home. The days following Karen's 911 call were anything but quiet. Mike's revelation that he'd been quietly gathering evidence against her gave you a glimmer of hope, but it also made you a target. Karen wasn't the type to let things go, and it didn't take long for her to retaliate. It started with small things. Your mailbox was mysteriously left open, and a few pieces of mail went missing. Then, one morning, you found your car's tires slashed. Deep, jagged cuts ran through the rubber, rendering it undrivable. You knew it was Karen. Who else would do something like that? But without proof, there was little you could do. Mike advised you to file a police report anyway, just to start a paper trail. She's testing you, he said one evening as you sat in his apartment, going over the evidence he'd collected. She wants to see how far she can push before you break. But if we play this right, she's the one who's going to crack. Mike's apartment was a stark contrast to yours. Where yours was cozy and cluttered, his was minimalist, almost sterile. The only personal touches were a few framed photos of him in uniform and a whiteboard covered in notes, photos, and diagrams. It looked like something out of a crime drama, and it was all dedicated to Karen. She's been embezzling HOA funds, Mike explained, pointing to a series of bank statements pinned to the board. See these withdrawals? They're supposed to be for maintenance and repairs, but there's no record of any work being done. And then there's this. He handed you a stack of emails between Karen and a local contractor. She's been inflating invoices and pocketing the difference. You frowned, flipping through the documents. How did you even get these? Mike smirked. Let's just say I have my ways. The point is, Karen's not just a bully, she's a criminal. But she's careful. She covers her tracks, And she's got the rest of the HOA board wrapped around her finger. That's why we need more than just this. We need witnesses. Easier said than done. Over the next few days, you and Mike reached out to other residents, hoping to convince them to come forward. Most were too scared to talk. Karen had a way of making people feel small, and the thought of crossing her was enough to keep them silent. But a few were willing to share their stories. There was Mrs. Alvarez, an elderly widow who'd been fined hundreds of dollars for unauthorized landscaping after she planted flowers in her own yard. Then there was Jamal, a college student who'd been threatened with eviction for playing his guitar too loudly, even though he only practiced during the day. And then there was Lisa, a single mom who'd been harassed for months after she accidentally parked in Karen's spot one time. Their stories were heartbreaking, but they were also exactly what you needed. Mike recorded their statements, and you helped compile the evidence into a cohesive case. But just as you were starting to feel like you might actually have a shot at taking Karen down, she struck again. One morning, you woke up to find your front door vandalized. The word "leave" was spray painted in bold red letters across the wood. Your stomach churned as you realized Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate you. She was trying to drive you out. Mike was furious when he saw it. "This is it," he said, his voice tight with anger. "She's crossed the line. We've got enough to take this to the police, but we need to move fast. If she finds out what we're doing, she'll destroy the evidence." You nodded, your resolve hardening. Karen had underestimated you, but she was about to learn the hard way that you weren't going anywhere. This wasn't just about you anymore. It was about everyone she'd ever bullied, harassed, or intimidated. And with Mike by your side, you were ready to fight back. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday night, and the tension in the air was palpable. You'd spent the last few days preparing with Mike, going over every detail of the case against Karen. The evidence was solid. Bank statements, emails, witness testimonies. But you knew Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. She'd spent years building her empire of control, and she wasn't about to let it crumble without a struggle. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a small, stuffy room that always smelled faintly of mildew. By the time you arrived, it was packed. Residents filled the rows of folding chairs, murmuring amongst themselves. Karen sat at the front, her clipboard in hand, looking as smug as ever. She didn't even glance your way as you and Mike took seats near the back. The meeting started as it always did, with Karen droning on about community standards and enforcing the rules. She brought up your parking violation again, her tone dripping with disdain. "Some residents," she said, glaring in your direction, "seem to think the rules don't apply to them. But let me be clear, this kind of behavior will not be tolerated." You clenched your fists, biting back the urge to interrupt. Mike placed a calming hand on your arm, his expression steady. "Wait for it," he whispered. "Let her dig her own grave." When Karen finally opened the floor for comments, Mike stood up. All eyes turned to him as he walked to the front of the room, his deputy's badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Karen's smug expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Officer," she said, her voice tight, "this is an HOA meeting, not a police matter. If you have concerns, you can bring them to me privately." Mike ignored her, turning to address the room. "Actually, this is a police matter. Over the past few months, I've been investigating numerous complaints about harassment, intimidation, and financial misconduct within this HOA, and the evidence points to one person, Karen." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Karen's face turned bright red. "That's absurd," she snapped. "I've done nothing but uphold the rules and protect this community." Mike didn't flinch. He pulled out a folder and began laying out the evidence. Bank statements showing unexplained withdrawals, emails detailing inflated invoices, photos of vandalism and harassment. One by one, he called up the witnesses you'd gathered. Mrs. Alvarez, Jamal, Lisa. They all stood up and shared their stories, their voices trembling but determined. Karen tried to interrupt, to deflect, but the tide had turned. The other residents, many of whom had been too scared to speak up before, began to chime in. They talked about unfair fines, baseless threats, and the constant fear of crossing Karen. The room grew louder and more chaotic, until finally Karen slammed her clipboard down on the table. "Enough!" she shouted. "This is a witch hunt. I've done nothing wrong and I won't stand here and be slandered like this." But it was too late. The HOA board, looking visibly shaken, called for a vote. One by one, they raised their hands to remove Karen from her position. When the final vote was counted, Karen was officially ousted. She stood there for a moment, her face a mask of fury, before grabbing her things and storming out of the room. The room erupted into applause, but Mike held up a hand to quiet them. "This isn't over," he said. "Karen will be facing criminal charges for her actions, and we'll need everyone's cooperation to make sure she's held accountable." As the meeting adjourned, you felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. It had been a long, hard fight, but you'd won. Karen's reign of terror was over, and the community could finally begin to heal. But as you walked out into the cool night air, you couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. She'd lost the battle, but the war wasn't over, and you knew, deep down, that you hadn't seen the last of her. The weeks that followed Karen's ousting were a whirlwind of change. The atmosphere in the complex shifted almost overnight. People who had once avoided each other in the hallways now exchanged smiles and greetings. The oppressive tension that had hung over the community like a dark cloud was gone, replaced by a sense of relief and cautious optimism. But while the neighborhood began to heal, you couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's shadow still lingered. Mike's investigation into Karen's activities had gained momentum. With the evidence you'd gathered and the testimonies from other residents, the police were able to build a strong case against her. She was formally charged with embezzlement, harassment, and vandalism, and a court date was set. The local news even picked up the story, painting Karen as the poster child for HOA corruption gone wrong. It was a small victory, but it felt good to see her held accountable. In the meantime, the HOA board underwent a complete overhaul. With Karen gone, the remaining members were eager to distance themselves from her toxic legacy. They held an emergency election, and to your surprise, you were nominated to fill one of the vacant seats. At first, you hesitated. You'd never seen yourself as the type to get involved in something like this, but Mike encouraged you to take the opportunity. "You've already done so much to stand up to Karen," he said. "This is your chance to make sure something like this never happens again." So you accepted the position, joining a new board made up of residents who were committed to transparency and fairness. Your first order of business was to review and revise the HOA's bylaws, removing the vague, overly strict rules that Karen had used to bully people. You also implemented a system for residents to voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. It was a lot of work, but it felt rewarding to be part of something positive. Mike, meanwhile, became something of a local hero. His role in taking down Karen earned him the respect and gratitude of the entire community. He continued to keep an eye on things, making sure Karen didn't try to stir up trouble from afar. But for the most part, she seemed to have disappeared. Rumor had it she'd moved to a different town, though no one knew for sure. You tried not to think about her too much, focusing instead on the future. As the months passed, the complex began to feel like a real community again. People hosted potlucks in the clubhouse, kids played together in the courtyard, and the once dreaded HOA meetings became a place for constructive discussion rather than fear and intimidation. You even started to get to know your neighbors better, forming friendships that went beyond the occasional hallway nod. Mike, in particular, became a close friend. What had started as an unlikely alliance had grown into a genuine bond. You spent evenings hanging out at each other's apartments, sharing stories and laughing about the absurdity of everything that had happened. He was the kind of person who always had your back, and you were grateful to have him in your corner. One evening, as the two of you sat on your balcony watching the sunset, Mike turned to you with a smile. "You know, if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here, having a beer with my downstairs neighbor after taking down an HOA tyrant, I would have called them crazy." You laughed, clinking your bottle against his. "Yeah, well, life's full of surprises, but I'm glad it turned out this way." As the sun dipped below the horizon, you felt a sense of peace settle over you. The fight with Karen had been exhausting, but it had also brought you closer to your neighbors and given you a chance to make a real difference. The complex wasn't perfect, no place ever was, but it was home. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like a home worth fighting for.